Well, if somebody has wisdom and the background and the insights to talk about new planetary narratives, is Dr. Paul Johann Calleman. Welcome to this Mothership Earth Summit as part of the World Happiness Festival. And actually, if you haven't read it yet, everybody please get this book, because it's about the living universe, and all the theories behind are built on years and years of research by who, at least for me, is the vanguard in many ways of something that can be called the theory of everything and the macro quantum theory. So welcome, Professor. And the first question I have for you is, what is this living universe that you are describing?
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Luis, for having me and for telling people about my new book, which is really sort of a completion of a number of books that I've written since 1993. When I had some insights regarding the Mayan calendar system that has sort of come to new and higher expressions, I would say, with every book that I've had written. And with this particular book, I feel it's a kind of a watertight book, at least in my own opinion. Of course, there are many people that might disagree. But really, most of the insights that I had regarding how our universe is created, how it evolves, and why we are here, and how we can continue from this point and on, most of those insights I actually had in a couple of years in the early 1990s. Because once I had realized that the Mayan calendar system was something much bigger than most people would have thought, that it actually is like a complete time plan for the evolution of the universe. Then lots of insights came to that. And when I say time plan, I think that's really what's important, that also a lot of people would benefit from knowing that the universe is not just a place that acts randomly and events take place without any kind of patterns or predictability. It does follow a time plan. And this time plan is really manifested through something that has been somewhat of an enigmatic spiritual entity in Mesoamerica. And Mesoamerica then means Middle America, and it includes Mexico and parts of Central America. They always built pyramids to honor something they called the plumed serpent. Huge pyramids. We're not talking about something sideline, some kind of an odd worship of some small little god. No, what was once the world's largest pyramid, which was in the city of Cholula in present-day Mexico, was dedicated to a plumed serpent. And the same is true for the world famous pyramid in Chichen Itza. It's the pyramid of Kukulkan, as the Maya would say, which is really the pyramid of the plumed serpent. And this was sort of mysterious for modern people, really, when this came to the surface. And people were wondering, why were they worshipping this serpent like a snake? And it doesn't sound like a very highly evolved species. And yet in Teotihuacan as well, there is a central pyramid dedicated to this plumed serpent. But once you realize that this is not actually a snake flying in the sky, it is instead a macrocosmic quantum wave And when we think about it, we can realize that if you are a person that do not have access to computers or where you can plot out a sine wave or something like that, you have to find some kind of a symbol in nature for this sine wave. And that's really what the ancients did. All over the world, we have this worship of serpents, and they are often the main creator gods if we go back to more than 2,500 years. And so once then I realized that this is a wave movement where there are peaks and there are valleys. There are times of forward movement, and then there is also times of, you might say, rest or even destroying the past in order to prepare for what is next to come. Once that was realized, it just seemed like most of the things would fit. And then I, have taken on, I'm looking at this through different aspects. And the key here, or I think the most important thing, is that because it's a wave movement that has a direction, it goes in a certain direction and has been going. There are several such waves that have been going with a particular direction. It means that also life on Earth is part of this wave movement and has a direction. And this direction is really what gives a kind of meaning to life, whether we are aware of it or not. But, we often encounter a situation where we wonder, was this meant to happen or was it not meant to happen? And, in terms of understanding the plumed serpent and the kind of wave movement that develops, really the question is it consistent with the wave movement or is it not consistent with the wave movement? And if it's not consistent with the wave movement, then it's not meant to happen, basically. But then, this is really a wave movement of consciousness. And this consciousness is without, you could think of a human being that has no consciousness. It could be fully working like a computer and have intelligence or something like that. But without that consciousness, without that distinction between some kind of an inner world with feelings and so forth, and a physical outer world, without that distinction, there would not be such a thing as value, significance, or meaning. We would be robots, basically. And yet we have this consciousness that makes ourselves into something more than just plain matter. And overall, you might say that what this theory that I've developed describes is how this consciousness follows certain patterns of evolution. And those patterns are really the patterns of the evolution of consciousness. I'm not sure if I answered your question, but I answered something, I think, Luis. I can't hear you. Oh, you have to unmute. Okay.
Oh, yes. Yes, Donald, you definitely did. Can we go a bit deeper into consciousness? Because as you know, there are so many different definitions of consciousness.
Yeah.
I still remember I was at the last conference in Arizona with all the researchers around the world on consciousness. And at some point, there was a conversation that they were looking in the wrong place. Because many of these researchers were looking into neurons, they were looking into the cells, into finding meaning and connections. But at some point, and I think this is part of your definition, consciousness is almost everything everywhere. But can we talk about a bit more about what is consciousness?
Yeah.
And if the universe is conscious?
Yeah. Right. Well, yeah. So certainly today there are two different schools, you might say, in the scientific community, at least, when as to how we are to define consciousness. And one of these schools that I belong to is saying that consciousness is fundamental. And even more so, it is the most fundamental aspect of existence of the universe. But then there is another school, which you might call the school of materialist philosophy. And it dominates the world of science today, established science anyway. And the idea in that school is to find somehow that consciousness was created by the brain. And so they do all these kind of neurological studies of the brain. And yes, they find very many interesting things. But I would say they certainly don't find the origin of consciousness. And so I would say that maybe the school that looks upon consciousness as fundamental is gaining ground, but it's still, two fundamentally different viewpoints here. What I do want to point out, though, is that some of the pioneers, or even most of the pioneers of the quantum revolution that took place about 100 years ago, really had the same view as I do today, which is that consciousness is fundamental. And Erwin Schrödinger, who is famous for having developed the Schrödinger equation that is basic to how quantum theory is understood today, he would say that we can never understand consciousness by means of anything else. In other words, it is fundamental. And we can never account for it even in physical terms, which is a very strong statement. It really means that we can really never exactly detect it or discover it by means of any kind of physical instruments we have. It doesn't make sense, because if it is fundamental, as he believed, and as well as Max Planck believed, who is really the father of quantum theory and then, in a sense, then modern physics. And so to me, then the question would be, how could you know anything about consciousness if you can't detect it by any physical instruments and so forth? But the thing that the Mayan calendar system adds to this picture is that it gives these waveforms, so we can sort of track the evolution of consciousness, even if we may never be able to prove that it is there. Our own experience will always tell us that we are conscious, and we can then track the evolution of consciousness. And in my most recent book that you showed recently, right now, consciousness is actually what activates the whole process of the evolution of the universe, the whole history of the universe. And it actually goes back to a point before the Big Bang. The Big Bang is really just the emergence of matter in the universe, but consciousness had already been activated before that. And what that means is that it is really fundamental, and its evolution is really what has guided the universe up until the present time, and will continue to guide us to the extent that we are able to resonate with this evolution of consciousness. So to answer your question, I really can't answer the question, what is consciousness? But certainly what I can have answered in this book is how consciousness evolves. And it is, if I'm to give some kind of a word to what it sort of just creates some kind of an inner order on a invisible level. But that, if you say that to an established or a proponent of the established view of consciousness, he would say that that has no substance. Well, it does have substance once you realize that there is a pattern to how consciousness is meant to evolve, and we are part of that particular time plan.
So, focusing on time plans and knowing that it's hard to define consciousness, but there is a substance and it's fundamental, and we can talk about evolution. What is the current state of evolution of humanity with respect to what it was and what it's going to be? Can we talk about where we are now and where we might be?
Okay, yes. So, one of the things we can learn from the ancient peoples of Mesoamerica that developed calendars in order to describe this serpent-like movement of consciousness is that there are different levels to it. There are different states of consciousness, and that's why they made pyramids like terraces. So you would make jumps between different levels, quantum leaps in consciousness, you might say. And the direction is to go to the top of the pyramid, because that's sort of when you're coming back to the unity of all things. And so in this sense, I think there is a significant message for from these ancient peoples, which is that it has a direction, and the direction is for us to go through the different states of consciousness until we actually recreate a kind of a state of unity consciousness, a state that doesn't create separations between people, a state that doesn't create separations between ourselves and our natural environment, and so forth. So that, I think, is sort of the key message of the whole system that they developed, that there is a direction, and that's where we're meant to go. And, I think it's fairly easy to see that if we all would have come to that state, the world would be peaceful. We would not no people would dominate other peoples, either on a personal level or on a more global scale, with certain nations dominating other nations, and so forth. In other words, that ninth wave, the ninth level of the pyramid, that wouldn't support a way of relating that is based on separation, that is based on dominance, simply. And in a sense, this state was activated, the highest state, the return of unity state was activated already in the year 2011. And, we then saw some kind of remarkable changes going on in the world. But on the other hand, that was also a sort of a shift that made several of these waves go down. And at the current time, it's a very complex situation because these waves are not just acting alone, they're creating an interference pattern. And it's out of these interference patterns that we are that our experience will be dominated by. And what that means is that still to this day, then, we are all mixtures of states of consciousness. We still have a strong ego, which in my understanding of things would emanate from the sixth wave of the nine-storied pyramid. And we also have sort of a blindness to this divine consciousness, because we are embracing also other. What shapes us is interference pattern of these different waves. Now, so, which means that, yes, I think there will be some very hard times ahead, at least most immediately. And exactly how that will play out, I don't think I can predict. But I do think there will be hard times. But that doesn't change, in my view anyway, the idea that there is a goal for this entire evolution, that is to return to another state of consciousness. And you might say humanity as such is still working on it. And you might say that in the current situation, that we all know that there's been a number of different challenges, to say the least. Now not only the pandemic and the climate change but now also warfare and things like that. And at the same time, the fact that in 2011 we attained that level where in principle it's possible to download a state of consciousness from the cosmos that gives us unity perspective on reality, means that there is also, at the same time as these kind of catastrophic events, or you can call them that or not, but I would, I think that there's been a lot of hardships in these couple of years since 2011. But at the same time, there is sort of a growing segment of humanity that says basically that, we could change, we could go into a more towards that state of consciousness that it is the overall goal, according to this time plan that I have outlined, including in this most recent book of mine. And I think the more people that get that intention, I think creating intention of unity consciousness, of creating intention to sort of shift to a state of consciousness that doesn't separate, that doesn't dominate or anything like that. That intention, I think, is you're contributing vastly to that by the World Happiness Foundation, and that's very, very important. I don't think we could all be happy until we all have come to embrace such a state. But to get there, it's an intention, and it's even not always something that you can ask what's in it for me, because it's really not in it for me as a separate individual that we're looking for. We're looking for what's in it for the planet, and that's my answer.
Thank you so much. And it's so encouraging listening to you. And I read all your books, and this one, there is something particular that you go into here, which is what happened before the Big Bang.
Yeah.
And maybe we can talk about that. But before, something very important when I go through your theory is that today, and this is something that we have to create awareness, and for the last 12 years, we have 9 waves that are happening at the same time. So when you talk about interference, it's because all these waves at some point are going to be matching. So, but at some point there was no waves, and that's probably before the Big Bang. So, yes. And this is something that you talk about in this book. So, the complexity, the message that I get is the complexity that we are living today is opening so many opportunities for humanity to get into a unified peaceful, harmonic, balanced point of view. But at the same time, is giving us so many opportunities not to do that. So actually, the more intentions we set into world peace, world happiness, world justice, equity, liberty, and harmony for all, for the better for everybody. But can we go deeper into before the Big Bang? What happened before?
Yeah, well, there are reasons to think that something happened before the Big Bang. I will say a few words about that. But before doing so, I also think that we have to recognize that there is some kind of a mystery at the beginning of time, at the beginning of this creation, that will always remain, that our minds will never, ever be able to fully grasp. And that doesn't mean that we can't talk about it. That doesn't mean that we can't know a little bit more about how it all started than previously. I mean, of course, it's an enormous change that has taken place. 250 years ago, people thought that God created the world in 7 days, regular days. I mean, I may also talk about days, but they are not regular days. These are time periods of creation. But so there will always be a mystery, and there is always something that we can't wrap our minds around, because it's not really linearly logical or whatever it is. But nonetheless, yes, there has been, especially in the last century, in the 20th century, scientists, physicists especially, were discovering that it seemed that the universe was fine-tuned for life. And what they meant by that was then that there are a number of constants that determine or specify the natural laws, the laws of physics. For instance, the law of gravitation, how with what strength do different masses attract each other, is determined by the gravitational constant. And what they found, and these are some of the most prominent scientists that dealt with this issue, like Stephen Hawking at Cambridge and so forth. What they found was that these constants were precisely fine-tuned. So if they would differ by only like a trillionth of the value that they actually had, life would not have emerged. There would not have been any life on our planet. And it all depended on different constants being very precisely fine-tuned. And then you may wonder, different suggestions came as to how are we to explain this? Especially since established science will not give any credibility to any idea of an intelligent creator or something like that. And so they said, well, we are here, so it must have been fine-tuned. Well, that's just a tautology, as it's called. But then another theory was that, well, there might be a gazillion different universes out there with different constants, and we happen to live in exactly the only one that had these right constants. Now, that is it sort of defies all statistical probability to say that we happen to be the one out of these gazillion different universes. So rather than that, there must have been something that acted to fine-tune, somehow prepare the universe for its continued evolution from its birth, almost like a gestation period when the not a fully adult being is being created in the gestation, but the basic organs are all there. And once then the birth happens of for instance, a human individual, if you make that parallel, then it would just grow and grow, but the basics are already there. It's the same thing, I think. There is a time frame before the Big Bang when these constants were fine-tuned. And I also think that based on what we know from the ancient Mexicans, we can also understand a little bit of how this is being done. Already before that, certain constants were set in order for us to prepare the universe, maybe 10 billion years later, to have a Earth, Gaia, that is in a sense living, but also has survived for billions of years. And the reason being that there were constants of nature that had been set. And they couldn't just be set randomly, so to speak. There must have been some kind of processes going on to prepare for that, in the same sense that a fetus prepares for what later will be coming out of as a human being at birth.
Well, you talk about a macrocosmic entanglement of the cosmic level, the galactic level, and the planetary and human levels. Can we talk a bit about that entanglement? What are those levels and how are they entangled?
Yeah, okay, thank you. Well, it's a big question and it's a very interesting question. First of all, you have to talk a little bit about what is entanglement. And it is a phenomenon that was also attributed, rightly so, to Erwin Schrödinger on the microcosmic level. In other words, what was found and what has been, well, actually the Nobel Prize last year went to a French experimenter, Alain Aspect, who discovered that if you have two photons, very simple particles, light particles, they each, if they're created together, they have their states, their quantum states are connected. And that's what's called entanglement. And what that means is that if you send those photons out in the universe, light years away, where they have no possible way of directly connecting, if one of them changes its states, it may, for instance, change its magnetic state from north to south. Instantaneously, without any time lapse in between them, the other particle will also change. So somehow on this, it means that these kind of particles and the kind of states that they're in are connected, regardless of the distance between them, and they're instantaneously connected. But what I'm introducing here is that is macrocosmic quantum entanglement. In other words, modern science, as it operates, it always wants to be reductionist. So it's, in my view, fails to look at the larger structures of the universe, like us, you and I, we are ultimately built around a state of consciousness. And so we are connected through this. And this is not just small little particles on a subatomic level. It's something that goes on higher levels, so that there is an entanglement not only between you and me, but there is also an entanglement between both of us and the Earth. And, the example I'm giving then is that our left brain half is connected with the Western hemisphere and the right brain half is with the Eastern hemisphere. And so we're macrocosmically entangled with the earth. So if the state of consciousness of the earth changes, so do our, at least to the extent that we have the intention of following along with that, we will also be entangled with the earth. And then the earth is entangled with the solar system, and then the solar system is entangled with a galaxy, and then ultimately even with the entire cosmos. And what that means is that we sort of, on some level, we are influenced on the level of consciousness, not necessarily our physical beings, but on the level of consciousness, we are entangled. And that goes up to the very largest scale of the entire universe. And I think it is from that ultimately all the creative impulses are generated that creates our world.
Wow. Yes. I mean, listening to me is so enlightening because I can expand and try to get into a grasping all this entanglement part. But actually, when we combine this with the waves, yeah. I'm very curious about wave number 5, because as we talk about new narratives, what you say is that during wave number 5, we had the rise of symbolic expressions.
Yes.
So can we go a bit deeper into the symbolic expressions of wave number 5 and how we can use some of these symbolic expressions to build a new narrative for human rising?
Oh, I like that question. Well, in a sense, I can't explain it. The emergence of symbolic expressions that took place about 100,000 years ago, when the 5th wave was activated. But there was a quantum leap to another level. And as that quantum leap happened, it just seems that human beings were transformed into something else, which was not just being like animals, really. And the evidence that we have for this is really from South Africa, where we find the oldest, not necessarily pieces of art, but we do find that they made ochre, which is really then clay and iron that you make dyes from. And these dyes must have been used either for decorating themselves or for creating some kind of cliff paintings that we yet haven't found. And we can also see that people started to perceive themselves a little bit differently, because not so long after that, people started to bury their dead. That's in present-day Iraq, in a cave there, that's found that people actually gave gifts to the deceased, and meaning what that tells us is really that they got a feeling that they had a soul, that there is something that will be preserved even though this body may die. And then from this, you can see that people started to become spiritual, if you like. In other words, they looked upon a spirit as distinct from the physical body. And then throughout this whole wave, it seemed that people just, started to develop more and more clear cave paintings, and up until civilizations came. But the point is that in this 5th wave, there was, as I understand it, and as the patterns would tell me, is that there was a unity consciousness then. And there are a number of findings. We don't really know how Neanderthals and other people in this era lived, but there are a number of findings indicating that already in those times, which is going like 40,000 years back or so, people would care for the elderly, people would care for deceased, and they started to have some kind of a value as human beings that probably, I would say, was more than just animals usually care for each other. And so there is something to learn from that, because in a sense, that state of consciousness that they were in did not have any filters, did not create separations. And you're hard-pressed to find any signs of violence or warfare from that earlier time. They probably did not even ask the question, what is in it for me? They probably just were in that kind of total entanglement with the cosmic source. And this didn't generate any technology, but it may have been very well so, even though we are sort of guessing, because we don't really know what life was like in those days. Certainly, it must have been hard in terms of living at the mercy of the forces of nature in a totally way. But it seems then that they had some kind of a basic unity of all existence, and even a unity that extended to plants and other and animals. The plants, somehow they learned, somehow they kind of knew what plants would be friendly and what plants wouldn't be friendly. And that, as I understand it, comes from that shift in consciousness that began in about 100,000 years ago and have developed ever since. But then in the past 5 or 10,000 years, it's come to be suppressed. Much of those abilities, much of that unity experience have come to be suppressed by the world of technology and the world of separation that civilization brought.
I have a last question, and probably this is your recommendation and your message to world leaders or any leader that can make a difference in their personal life and their communities in the coming years, knowing about what you know, and you probably have more information than many other people around the world, and you study thoroughly all these signals, the Maya cosmology, the Mayan cosmology. You are a biologist. You've created the macrocosmic quantum theory, the theory of everything. Go deeper. I mean, what is your recommendation for people? Because we know that we are all in different stages.
Yeah.
We know that we all are exposed to more than ever before. But is there a recommendation that you can give to all of us in order to navigate the coming years?
Yeah, I think what comes to mind are two recommendations. One is listen to the indigenous peoples, because they are much more in tune with that kind of a unity with the nature that basically I outlined when I talked about the fifth wave. So protect and listen to the indigenous peoples. That's one thing. The second thing is really to have that intention of going to a state of the highest state of consciousness, the unity state of consciousness. And once you have that intention, things may start to work out in that direction. But without that direct with that intention, it may never happen. And so, I'd also like to recommend my own books, because that would sort of tell us that this idea is not just some kind of a wild idea based on nothing. There is a logic to that, and it is to come to embrace that seems to have been the direction of the universe as it was understood by many ancient peoples. And so I do think that should be added as a recommendation to this.
Well, thank you so much. As always, Professor Carl Johan Calleman, your wisdom is inspiring so many people. And now we have even more insight with your new book about the new direction. Thank you so much for reminding us that we have to set this intention. And to set this intention requires collective healing in many ways, as well as collective wisdom. So thank you so much for being light for so many in the world, and for your contributions to humanity. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Luis. Thank you for having me.